Thank you, Charlie, for joining this DRR Pioneer interview. You studied economics at the London School of Economics. How did you then get engaged in disaster work in general and DRR work in particular? Because it's not like the obvious connection between the two fields.
Sure. So it was really totally, absolutely by accident. I graduated in 1985 with, as you said, a degree in economics, and I went then straight on to volunteer for a very small research institute in London called at that time the International Disaster Institute. That was at the tail end of the mid-1980s African drought and famine. And so that crisis dominated the work that the organization was engaged in at that time. It then had a new director that would have been probably around late 1986, who was an economist himself, Ed Clay. And Ed at that point took me onto the payroll, working very closely with him initially on food aid, food policy. And the organization at some point changed its name to Relief and Development Institute because it was felt that International Disaster Institute wasn't a great name to turn up with. It sort of made people a little nervous that you were on the scene because you were in what was deemed a disaster situation. So I then left there in about 1989 and went on to do a master's degree, also in economics at the LSE. Then spent about 18 months working in the city, which I hated, and then rejoined the group I'd been working with, by which time they had merged with ODI, with the Overseas Development Institute. And very shortly thereafter, Ed was approached by the World Bank to do some research on the economic impacts of droughts in sub-Saharan Africa. So I was heavily involved in that work. And then on the back of that, I applied in the mid-1990s for some research funding by FCDO, ODA as it was then, to take that forward to do some further work on the economic impacts of disasters in Fiji, Vietnam and the Philippines. And I led that work and undertook most of it directly myself. So it was not a chosen destination. I sort of meandered along and somehow found myself in a space where there were very few people working and a lot of opportunity to take it forward.
And was there already a link with DRR at that time, or was it mainly looking at the economic impact of disasters? Or were you already looking at cost benefit and all of that? Or?
Yeah, not really so much cost benefit. I guess that came over time, and I think partly really due to the IDNDR, which linked me into that wider community. So through which I met the likes of John Twigg, Ian Davis, and you know that whole crowd who were Andrew Masgrave, who were more orientated into the disaster risk reduction world, and in particular I then went on to work with John Twigg and with John Mitchell. Actually, we did that work on the role of NGOs in disaster risk reduction, which, if I recall correctly, was actually funded by IDNDR, the UK committee.
But there were not many people interested in the topic of economics and disasters at that time. I mean, you're still somehow like known to be the focal point in the field. I mean, at that time it was pretty lonesome job to focus on economics and disasters, I presume.
Yeah, I'm certainly not the known focal point these days. I think people of an older generation still think of me in that regard, but there are many people working on various aspects of this and very successfully taking it in a number of very important dimensions. So it has emerged as quite a big topic. But it was at that time very much an open field, and particularly in terms of drilling down to individual country case studies, there was a lot of kind of rhetoric sort of broad kind of assumptions on how disasters might impact economies, but very little substantive work that had been done, particularly on a longitudinal basis, to see how over time these things play out, and then to link back to the fact that those impacts were not inevitable, and therefore there were measures that could be taken to enhance resilience.
Okay, and what were your major achievements in those early days? I mean, when you look back at it, what were your insights also at that time that have then somehow guided your further career? But also probably there were some challenges. I'm just thinking about getting the data or interpreting the data. I mean, can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so I mean, the big achievement I would say is helping to play a role in getting that solid evidence-based research underway, and really helping to get the agenda off the ground. And weirdly, one of the early case studies I did on Vietnam is still knocking around. People still occasionally mention it, tell me they've just read it and how valuable it is, and which I do find very hard to believe. But maybe, you know, for some countries there still isn't a lot that's been done. Challenges. In those early days, it wasn't so difficult getting funding, or at least, you know, relatively small scale funding, because I think intuitively it was a potentially important area. And also there wasn't a lot of competition to get money in that area. So it was fairly easy to locate, to secure some research funding. The biggest challenges you've alluded to was really doing in-depth evidence-based country work. Going beyond that kind of high level conjecture to tease out really how economic fiscal consequences of disasters play out over time, and therefore to find those concrete recommendations to enhance resilience at a macro level, and then feeding down, you know, into individual sectors and measures that could be taken. The desk-based work in particular was a real challenge. I did a small bit of work when I was at ODI for the British Geological Survey, working with Simon Young, who's a volcanologist, modelist, has gone on to work with CRIF and beyond, and then with someone called Peter Baxter, who was a medical doctor specialising in the health impacts of ashfall or volcanic ash, and a few others. And the task was to do an assessment of the hazard or the risk posed by a volcano in Costa Rica that was adjacent to the capital of the country, San Jose, and it had last erupted back in about 1963. And I had to do a desk-based study from nothing on what the economic and also the kind of the community impacts of that eruption might be. And that was a really difficult bit of work because there was just nothing really to work off. A few small pieces of work on the impacts of the 1963 eruption, but nothing beyond that. But even the in-country research wasn't particularly easy. I did a number of very intense periods in various countries. You know, you'd have to really run around trying to persuade people to meet you, trying to persuade them that it was actually of relevance to what they were doing, whether they were in government or the private sector. And it was always particularly frustrating getting meetings with ministries of finance, particularly in countries that hadn't recently experienced disasters, and trying to explain why there was a link between fiscal management and disasters. And even in country as well, you know, collecting data, you'd come back with suitcases full of volumes and volumes and volumes of annual development plans and all sorts of things.
And which are the main lessons that you gained in those early days, which you think are still relevant today, but may not always be known or be followed by the next generation of economists or DRR people? Because I mean, there's always we hear a lot about reinventing the wheel, and people not being willing to listen to what what past generations have found as their insights. And are there any lessons that you learned which you think are still very relevant today?
Yeah, I mean, so the obvious one, which is acknowledged, is that disasters do indeed have potentially very significant, far-reaching economic, fiscal, social impacts, and they're not inevitable. And we did have to work quite hard to get that view across, but I don't think anybody would dispute that these days. One thing that was very apparent then, and I think remains a big issue, is around the fact that we still work in silos between the various groups working on various aspects of disasters. So back in, would have been maybe 92, 93, under the kind of the earlier years of IDNDR, the UK committee organised a meeting of scientists and social scientists. And the idea was that we would come together and we would listen to each other and understand why we were all engaged in this one topic. I think we focused specifically on drought, if I remember correctly. And in the morning, the scientists had the floor and they presented on their work about climatic patterns and predictive techniques and so on. And the social scientists asked the questions, and I thought the social scientists asked intelligent, clever questions. And then in the afternoon it was reversed, and the social scientists spoke and the scientists asked the questions. And at that point it became apparent that actually perhaps we weren't really speaking the same language at all, because the questions coming from the scientists showed quite some significant lack of understanding of what social scientists were all about. And no doubt the questions that had been asked in the morning had been equally sort of wanting. And on some levels the situation, I think, has improved enormously. It is now a much more interdisciplinary subject. You do work alongside scientists and so on. But there's still that saying, you don't know what you don't know, still very much applies, and you do hit upon the boundaries of people's understanding and knowledge, and they still show through. And in a sense, I think, and perhaps younger people would totally disagree, but I sometimes feel that those of us who have been around a longer time perhaps have a better breadth of understanding. Perhaps we've been forced to dabble a little bit more in areas beyond the area where we're most comfortable, and we perhaps know a little bit more what we don't know, and where the limitations of our understanding lie.
Okay. I mean, when speaking to some of the more kind of radical or critical DRR pioneers, they said that disaster risk creation is as much an issue, or even a more important issue, than disaster risk reduction. And then they kind of point to some of the bigger international financial mechanisms that sometimes do contribute to risk. Is it one of your tasks at ADB to make sure that all their investments are either risk sensitive or climate sensitive, so that risk creation is being avoided? Or is this an uphill struggle in your little corner within ADB?
No, ADB is pretty good. We have a climate risk screening tool which has been in place for a number of years, and that also now takes into account disaster risk as well. So projects are screened,
but still there are interests sometimes which do not necessarily coincide with the risks. No?
Sure, and it's complicated because country building codes, standards still apply generally, and so on and so forth. So it's not a straightforward issue.
Okay, and I mean, and now when we reflect on the field of DRR now and the changes, I mean, there's been massive changes since let's say 2000 or so. I mean, there's first the resilience that came about after Kobe, and then climate also got much more dominant in the field. I mean, how do you see that? Is this a positive development, or is this a more challenging context? Because also, from my perspective, DRR has been much more fragmented. I mean, there's like now many communities, and there's like people dealing with DRR and ecosystems. There's people that do climate adaptation. How do you see the field now from your perspective? Is there a linear improvement, or is it still a very challenging field to deal with?
You know, I think that probably varies from organization to organization and country to country on how well particularly that integration with climate change goes. Where I work at the Asian Development Bank, you know, we have the benefit of being a relatively small institution. So I sit within the same division as my climate change colleagues, and we do work very closely together. I think disaster risk reduction can get quite lost in the emphasis that is placed on climate change. That emphasis in turn is often, and this is going beyond ADB, is often more on mitigation than adaptation. I feel we quite often need to make the point that disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management is not a subset of climate change. It is a topic in its own right. There are significant areas of overlap, and it is very important to work very closely with climate change colleagues, not least because, as we all know, you know, if you don't take climate change into account in risk reduction measures, you are potentially creating future risk, or at least not achieving the benefits you would hope to achieve through your risk reduction efforts. So I think there's swings and roundabouts. I think we probably are getting more attention than we have, and that is partly due to climate change as well. Certainly in Asia, we are seeing evidence of increasing frequency, intensity of climate events. At the same time, you know, we're all, well, in the disaster risk management, well, we're very aware that it's, you know, exposure vulnerability are also increasing. And so it's not just about climate change that's fueling that.
Okay, and maybe now a more specific question about the Philippines, where you're based. I mean, they are known, at least in literature, in being highly effective to deal with the main disaster they're facing, which are the typhoons and some of the other geological hazards. Is this also your impression that that the Philippines could be used as an example for other countries in the region or elsewhere? Yeah, in addressing the challenges and being well organized in terms of early warning, in terms of not needing external help anymore. Since Haiyan, there's not been any call for international aid, as far as I remember. So they really seem to be able to have their act together and have also the structures at the local level that can effectively respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Philippines is certainly within developing Asia and the Pacific, one of the countries furthest advanced in its financial preparedness, its financial arrangements for disasters. It's had various insurance pilots, sub-sovereign, sovereign insurance. It's had a number of contingent disaster loans, which do disperse. So we've had one quite recently that has dispersed. So it's not necessarily that international assistance isn't provided after disasters. It's been perhaps provided in slightly different ways. It's also got in place a very solid governance structure, which goes down to the local level. It's got funds in place right the way down to the local level. I think it is doing a fair amount, and as you say, the early warning systems are pretty good. There was some learning after Haiyan, but no, I think the country is doing well.
Looking back at IDNDR, I mean, most people said like there was a heavy focus. It was very technocratic, yes, heavy hazard focus. You being an economist, I mean, I think economy is somewhere in between, let's say, social vulnerability and the physical side. At least that's how the outside world may see it. Did you feel like you were able to, or together with Ed and others, to influence and get economics on the radar screen of the disaster people at that time? Or was it still very much all about the physics of and geoengineering and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that going into the IDNDR in 1990, you know, social economic aspects were not on the table at all. And by the end of the decade, they were. So they were certainly the poorer relative. But I think we progressed. We were definitely in a minority group, but were given some space and some time. So overall, I think it was positive, in as much as there was growth over that period that perhaps might not have happened in quite the same way, because it did bring people together.
Thanks so much, Charlie, for the interview. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you all the best in the end of your career at ADB. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bruno. It's been a pleasure.